Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 296. What do you love most about your job? If you can't answer that question, perhaps you've forgotten. Tad Reeves, our guest this week, is a principal architect at Arbery Digital. And in this discussion, you're going to hear how he's consistently provided the answer to the question of what he loves in technology. Tad started studying mechanical engineering in school and then made a pivot to focus on graphic design. But around that same time, he also wandered into this field we call technology. Throughout this discussion, you're going to hear a theme of pursuing interests and learning. Tad took the time to fill knowledge gaps and build expertise so that he could go on to bigger and better things. How exactly did he do that? Let's hear the full story as we get to part one of our discussion with Tad Reeves. Tad Reeves, welcome to Nerd Journey.
Hey, thank you.
Let's start by telling the listening audience a little bit about who you are and what you do today, please.
Sure. I am a principal architect for Arbery Digital. Our company is a consulting firm. We specialize in doing work on content management systems. Specifically, Adobe Experience Manager is our expertise, which is a large digital experience platform that's used by major enterprises and so forth, deals with digital asset management and so forth. So we get to deal with a lot of big companies, and that's been my focus the last 15 years or so. But yeah, technologist at heart.
Well, speaking of experiences, your first collegiate experience, I think, was studying graphic arts. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you select that discipline?
I actually have to go back a little bit earlier than that to give you enough context. When I was in high school, starting when I was about 12 and up through high school, I actually wanted to design cars.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I was a complete car nerd, and I still have all these car facts rattling around. I actually freaked my kids out the other day because they're like, didn't you always do computers? I'm like, no. See that car in front of us? Okay, 2-liter, twin cam, 16 valve, turbocharged and intercooled. It's got a beam rear axle. Where did this come from? But no, I wanted to design cars. And so I got myself into mechanical engineering school at Oregon State, because mostly I was on the fence about whether I wanted to be more on the art side of design or whether on the eng side of design, designing cool little, mechanisms or something like that, or did I want to actually do visual design? So I ended up starting with ME. But then at the same time, it was fortuitous and heartbreaking at the same time. But I got an internship with a guy who is a seismic engineer, and he specialized in doing seismic engineering retrofits for buildings. And he had just moved up from the Bay Area to where I was living in Oregon at the time, moved into this farm. And he said, tell you what, half your time, I need you to help me make this barn into an office. So I was like driving the ditch witch and laying his gas line and all kinds of stuff. And then half the time I was being his, gopher. And I saw what being an engineer is day to day. And I was thinking like it'd be like designing like cool like springs under buildings to absorb shock. And it was really just, okay, we're going to take a shear wall that's in this part of the building, pages and pages of calculations to come up with the exact thickness and height of this shear wall to stop vibrations at this amplitude. And that's what I did. And isn't it awesome? And I'm looking at these pages of calculus and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, I don't want to do that. That's not what I want to spend the rest of my life doing, which was kind of heartbreaking because I was going into my second year of eng school at the time. And I was like, okay, I'm going to have to tell everybody I know that I'm not going to be an engineer anymore because I don't want to do that. So, which is really weird. I was actually, in tears to my parents and stuff. And they're like, it's okay. You're not making anybody mad or sad or whatever by changing a career to something you like.
Were either of your parents, were they engineers already? Did that
No.
make it harder or?
No, actually, that was the strange part about being emotional about it, is because they were just fine with whatever I wanted to do. My mom was a nurse and my dad was an electrician. So I ended up switching gears. I had a big interest in design anyway, and I was always designing stuff and newsletters and things. I said, whatever, I'll do graphic design. So I did that for a year in college, but then at the same time, I was spending all my spare time fixing stuff. And I was always tinkering with computers and stuff. That wasn't my original interest, but it was one that drew me. And then the whole thing changed. I got a job at a little internet service provider. It's an itty bitty 1,000 subscriber local ISP in Tigard, Oregon. I did tech support for them for like $6 an hour or something like that. And that was when I went, okay, the pay, that's not what I'm here for. But the problems I was solving were genuinely cool. They had my interest. I built our modem rack, which is this, we cannibalized like 80 boxed USR 33.6 modems and mounted them to an old telco rack. And so we had this like closet of doom with all these like Star Trek style blinking lights and stuff. It was fabulous. But having the rush come in and seeing that thing just light up with subscribers, like that was my first moment of like, okay, making stuff that a bunch of people use and watching them crawl over my gear, that's cool. Graphic design's awesome. It's a lot of fun, but this is really awesome. And it's a place where nobody really is, because this is a 96. So internet's still brand new. Everybody's still figuring everything out. That was where I kind of switched gears and ended up saying, okay, I want a career doing computer stuff.
That's interesting. So you mentioned the mechanical engineering. You got to see what that was really like. Do you think that it wasn't making a big enough impact on people to stabilize the wall and dampen that vibrations? Like you weren't seeing the return on your efforts?
With the right people in my life earlier on that journey, I think that probably some of those decisions could have been different. There were some conversations that I had in engineering school where we had some math and some physics classes that were, I was out of my depth, and I went to my professor and I'm like, I should be able to take this, but I feel like I'm out of my depth. And he's like, well, this is a weed out class. What are you talking about, weed out class? He's like, well, we like all the people who don't really, really want to be here, we want to get them out. So you're actively trying to get rid of me. And he's like, yeah. And it was a little bit heartless too. And so I was kind of like, I don't know if I'm down with that. So there are a couple moments like that kind of probably pushed me from what otherwise would have been probably a career I probably would have been happy with.
And I would imagine also that the designing of that rack of modems, the spatial design of the room, the cabling, the power, all that stuff, organizing that maybe isn't so different than going and working on a car in your spare time.
It isn't. So there's the design of that, and then there's the presentation of that. This is at a time where to get new subscribers, people would come in and they'd say, I've heard about internet and can I get on? So I was teaching internet classes to people, brand new people, teaching them how to use the internet. So I'd like 15 people at a time. I teach them how to use the internet. But then I'd bring them into my show closet, open the door grandiosely and show them all my blinking lights. And so there's a bit of the design thing too.
Yeah. The beginnings of the data center tours, right?
It's true.
You go and tour the big data centers now. It's really cool.
That's right.
You did support for that ISP, 1990s, you're fielding calls, right?
Oh, yeah.
How do you feel like that impacted your troubleshooting skills?
I think almost anybody who's involved in technology should have a support job like that sometime in their life. I've told my kids this too. It's like, I really feel like almost everybody should have a customer service job. Whether you work in restaurant or you're working at a store, you're working, retail sales or something like that. Because there are skills you learn also being able to just control your own reactions to things and being able to really just focus on servicing a customer rather than, do you realize what you just said? Sort of a reaction. That takes drilling. And as a kid, you don't know how to do that. So there's a lot of maturing that you do. I'm sure you can imagine just people brand new to the internet, not even knowing, like, I don't know if we have time to tell stupid internet stories, but I'm going to tell you one stupid internet story. So I'm on the phone and the person's calling. They're like, yeah, it doesn't work. And I'm trying to do the telephone tech support thing, where you're trying to visualize their screen and what they're seeing, right? And they're like, yeah, it doesn't work. So we're using whatever, Windsock or, something like that to log in. So click on it. What does it do? It's not doing anything. Okay. And I'm going through this whole troubleshooting checklist. And he's like, no, it's not doing anything. No, I can't really see it right now. Well, why can't you see it right now? It's like, well, the power's out. She's like, yeah, I'm calling a cell phone. So just so you know that the internet requires your computer to be on and it to be powered up. It needs that. I'm like, yeah, it very much definitely need that. Why don't you give me a call back as soon as your power's back on?
That's so great.
But it's stuff like that you kind of have to, like, I was just about to get in my car and go out there before they said, oh yeah, no, don't come out here. We got a power outage.
Well, I was just about to ask that. Was going to people's houses and helping them part of the job, or you just couldn't do that because they were too far away?
I actually did it a couple of times. Yeah. Yeah, I did. It was right about then too that I was like, okay, I should dive into this hard. And if I'm going to not have a $6 an hour tech support job, I'm going to need to get good at stuff. So I think that was where my career started to change. Cause I had the pressure of like, I can't afford anything more than fast food and like $100 a month car payment. And I'm living with my dad. There's some necessity that kind of like, okay, now you're driven to do something. So we had, where I lived, we had an all-night Starbucks. So there's not too many of those. So I went and I got a couple of networking books. At the time, Microsoft still had great certifications at that time too, even back in the day. So I got myself through Networking Essentials and a couple other, just basic books like that. That moment of trying to understand the very basics of how does the internet even work and all the words about it. That was the moment where, okay, now I can actually get a job where I'm doing something bigger than just working at a little itty bitty ISP.
Yeah, let me ask about that certification studying, because a lot of people study for certifications differently. There's this exam guide or blueprint of all the materials you need to know for this certification. You might have to buy a book or take a course or whatever it is these days. But in your case, you had some practical experience with some of the technologies, maybe not knowing all the concepts deeply, and then you went and took the certification in networking. So I'm just curious, did the order of those things affect your learning processes and how well you learn the material then and the way you study for certification type tests throughout your career?
That's a really great question. So first of all, these days you've got all these different marquee certifications that people go and study for, and they have everything to do, and it's really a lot more known that, hey, if you've got a CCIE or if you've got your an architect and this and that, that you're going to be able to get a job or a better job as a result of holding that certification. That was not known at the time. This is when I started studying intensely. Like this was like 97 or something like that. That path and that career pathway or whatever I was supposed to do was not known. What I did know was that I loved the internet and I didn't understand how it worked. Every so often I'd be trying to troubleshoot something with somebody upstream from me, and they're talking about routing, and they're talking about, something about BGP or something like that. And I'm like, wow, they're saying words and I have no clue what this means. And then you start diving into words and you're like, okay, so in order to understand this words, there's other fundamental concepts that you need to have. So the thing that was interesting to me at the time is I really liked the idea of running a mail server. I don't know why. I like the idea of running a mail server. And Exchange was interesting. So I'm like, I'm going to study about, this. But then I just had to keep backtracking until I was just sitting in internet fundamentals. Let's see how a TCP handshake works. Let's see how does it make a connection? How do you get it from here to here? How does it route? All those basics. And I feel like unpacking all of that and then putting it all back together, that was what was driving me. I actually wasn't trying to get a certification at this point in time. And in fact, I ultimately, after getting through a bunch of thick books, I don't think I even went for any certifications. I just went through the entire book. But I at least felt at the end of it that I could be valuable and I knew what was going on. And I knew that I could troubleshoot stuff. Whereas before I was just shooting in the dark most of the time.
I love the idea of you wanted to understand it deeper because it was interesting to you. And I think that we can apply this wherever we are in our career. In your case, it was a large part of what you did, and you wanted to maybe do more of that or get paid more, and you felt like you needed to understand at a deeper level. With so many technologies out there, it's really hard to pick what the thing is that we're going to go and dive deep on. How has that adapted for you since those early days of choosing, hey, I'm going to focus here, I'm going to focus there?
So at the risk of skipping too far ahead, I'm going to tell you one thing that has happened a few times in my career. I've gone back to my old high school, which is a boarding school in Oregon. And I've gone back there to give talks to high school students about just technology careers and stuff like that. And I think the first one of those that I did was, about 15 years ago or something like that. The thing that I tend to forget and that I only kind of rediscover really when talking to younger kids is that when you're 16 and you're sitting there, you're flat out, especially if you're going to a good school and you're really trying to get into a good college with the aim of like, what can I do? What are the effective things that I can do to prepare myself for a career? You're looking forward to a career. And when you're in a career, especially when you're in operations, right? There's problems with burnout and there's problems with people getting beaten down. And a lot of times the prevailing emotional level tends to be this kind of one of drudgery, of like kind of this time to make the donuts kind of a attitude, right? Where you sometimes forget what got you into this in the first place until you go to a school and some innocent kid asks you, what do you love the most about your job? And you're like, give me a sec. Actually, you know what I love about this? And then you kind of remember, like, there's some stuff about this that is really cool. And then you go and appreciate the number of things there are to be interested, because, we're sitting there doing magic every day.
Oh, yeah.
You and me are here in different parts of the country having a video conversation.
It's all magic packets.
It is. And so I found that nurturing and keeping attention on that level of interest, I think, is kind of everything. Recognizing that interest is going to end up, ultimately get you jobs and keep you jobs. Because I feel like this is a theme that I could probably come back to again and again, is the number of times that I don't feel like I'm the most technically superior person in the room a lot of the time. But there's a lot of times where I'm the most interested and the most willing to communicate about it. And there's a lot of times there's somebody who might be technically much more proficient, but they're bored. They want to go home. Which one of us is going to end up in the lead role, sort of a thing. And so it's that level of interest and picking something that you want to be interested in, and then was really just nurturing that.
Yeah. And when you are the person who's most interested in something, people notice it. And a lot of times it can enable you to explain something better or communicate it even better, at least a specific concept, maybe better than someone who's more technical, because you get the communication part of that discussion. Or what does this person need to hear? Like the kids in high school, what do they specifically need to hear? What can you give them that isn't like, well, I learned BGP and global side load balancing and that changed my life. Well, what does that even mean? Your answer when they asked you what you love was that you get to follow what's interesting, or was it a little bit different?
So I think my answer has been different in different times. I've worn all these different and sundry hats around large site work. And I've kind of found myself kind of in almost all of them at some point in time. But I kind of come back to these big sites, and this one thing that does continue to drive me is this love of making stuff that people use and then watching a bunch of people use it. It must be analogous to the joy that must be felt to somebody who designs a bridge
or bakes a wonderful meal.
Yes, exactly. And then to go out there and watch people enjoying the wonderful meal. I think it's very similar to that. It's that creation for others and then watching it then unfold, which started as a nugget from you creating that. And I think that's the part that continues to drive me along.
And it started with the modem closet. That's awesome. So after you started studying what was in the books to understand more of how the internet worked, getting a better job, what did that look like moving forward? You mentioned these different sites, large sites. So how do you go from small ISP to now I'm going to work in a bigger pond?
So it was a little bit fortuitous. This is back before the days of Career Builder or Monster Board or even LinkedIn or anything like that, right? I didn't know how I was supposed to get a better job. I literally printed out my resume. I would walk into big corporate headquarters and say, I'm looking for a job, Great Depression style. But I responded to a newspaper article that I found for tech support, and it turned out it was for Web Trends, which is headquartered in downtown Portland. And at the time, Web Trends was kind of the 600-pound gorilla of web analytics. And at that point in time, web analytics was all a science of log analysis, essentially. This is before JavaScript could really be counted upon to be executed, and tracking beacons were a thing. So if you wanted to know how many people came to your website, you'd have to sit and tear through web server logs. And so WebTrends had a product to go through and do just that. A lot of the biggest websites on the internet use them as a product, and I ended up in there doing support for them. So a lot of it was spent on the phone. A bunch of it was spent. Sometimes they'd have to send me these logs. So in 1998, we were already using email to have people email me 600 megabyte log files.
Wow.
Yeah, and so whenever later on in life, people are saying, "Oh yeah, my email is limited to 5 megs." I'm like, okay, it doesn't have to be. So a bunch of it was telephone tech support, but for local customers, a lot of times we just go out there. So sometimes somebody having a problem on something and setting up, and so I ended up going out to a couple places and configuring IIS and stuff like that. So that was my first enterprise data center stuff was going and doing that. But also, I just got a chance to learn how things like even just get exposure to something like a cluster. I had only been exposed to like a web server running off of an computer before. So just the whole idea that, oh wow, your website uses more than one computer. Like,
yeah, whoa. Why do we even need to do that?
How many modems would access it that you would need more than one computer? That was kind of a wild ride. But it was in doing that I kind of found that sort of theme of interest kind of driving me, because I kept going, well, somebody say, oh, well, this is Netscape Enterprise Server, which was one of the web server choices at the time. And so I'm like, well, what is that? How would you set that up? This is kind of where I started having my own mad scientist lab that, I think every networking guy has. But this is where I started my own one and got old laptops and, ran web servers on them and all that sort of thing, set up my own Exchange server. And I was doing all that out of my house, got a permanent ISDN line put into my house with a 64K up and down. So that was when I hit the big times.
When you were looking for the jobs and you stumbled upon WebTrends, did the impact they were making for so many customers, was that part of the reason you wanted to work there, or did it kind of accidentally end up making you enjoy it more later and you just really wanted a job in a bigger pond?
No, so it scratched both itches. Statistics and analytics also fascinate me. That confluence of things happens all the time in operations land, where you're looking at graphs of all kinds of various sorts, and you're drilling into things. So working with a tool, which at the time was the tool that all these big companies would use to run all this stuff, and you could see pretty graphs of all kinds of different stuff, and then all of a sudden getting all these insights that you always kind of wanted of like, look at all these people searching for this. SEO was in its infancy at that time, and so all these different things that you could gain from web server logs. So it was that at the same time. So both of them were kind of a happy car crash of things that I really dug.
So you got the analytics piece, the statistical analysis piece. You learned about clustering and high availability systems. So once you know those pieces, how do you decide what to do next?
So I didn't decide. All I knew was for sure I needed something bigger. And I was only 20 at the time, 21. I had a travel itch at that point. So I'm like, okay, I got to get out of this town where I've been. Portland's awesome, but I'm going to move someplace. So this is one of these other ones that I think is a theme that I could probably come back to a few times, of things that changed my career and were more of a factor than other things. It wasn't just that I was a better developer at this than somebody else or something like that. One of those things is a set of well-honed written and verbal communication skills and a willingness to use them. Willingness to just go and talk to somebody, even if it seems weird or what are they going to think about this? Just do it. And it was one of these, which was a next major jump of the career, which I ended up across the country. That was kind of a wild story.
Do you want to share it?
So I wanted to change. I had no idea how. I ended up going to visit a friend of mine for her birthday in Omaha. We were long school buddies. So I visited her in Omaha. I ended up connecting with this guy who he taught Cisco classes. And it turned out that he had a job idea, but it was for like a senior sysadmin. And I'm like, I'm a junior guy. I know, but I could be a senior sysadmin. And he's like, well, tell me what you got. And I give him kind of my spiel about what I'm interested in. He's like, well, that's cool, but sorry. So I kind of need you to like come talk to me. And I'm like, well, where are you at? He's like, well, I'm teaching a class in Wichita. And I'm like, tell you what, I'm going to rent a car right now. I'm going to drive down to Wichita. I'm going to meet you. And he's like, no way. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going right now. And so I drove from Omaha down to Wichita and I met him for dinner.
Wow.
I drove down there and I met him. And it went really great. And next thing I know, he landed me a job at State Farm Insurance as a Windows NT sysadmin. It was awesome that I landed this job. I was in pure terror because it was basically a senior sysadmin. It was a L3 sysadmin job. And at the time, State Farm had the largest NT server deployment in the world at that time. And they were shortly afterwards surpassed by McDonald's. But at the time, they had more because they ended up doing this big deployment where they threw an NT4 server into every single agent office for their, all their various apps and stuff like that. So there's like 33,000 servers or something like that. So there's this ridiculous topology of permissions, and it was in the days before Active Directory. So we had all these backup domain controllers all over the place, and it was pretty wild. Basically, as soon as I landed this job, I went and I found somebody who had a bunch of installation CDs, and I just went crazy hitting the books so that I could arrive at least sounding like I wasn't a fake. So once again, it's like this interest thing. Like I wanted to solve all the problems. I'm like, I may not have the answer. I'm totally going to find it. And every night I would just get home and I'd just hit the bat cave and try to study. It was kind of a wild life for about 5 months. I would say 3 months actually before it kind of settled out. And I was like, yeah, I can do this. I'm trying harder than everybody else and nobody else is trying. So I'm actually okay.
You're racing to achieve competence faster than they are building upon theirs.
Yes, exactly.
Were the communication and writing skills pretty honed by that point because of what you had done to write the newsletters you mentioned before and all the phone support you did doing troubleshooting?
I think so. I don't know that anything prepared me as well as the telephone tech support at the ISP and at WebTrends. I think between those two things, I feel like I could have almost virtually telepathically solved anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not true, but I got to the point where there was no craziness that somebody could give me over the phone that I couldn't go and deal with. Because in some cases too, that was my first also real dealing with outages and people who were anxious about the upstream impacts about whatever their systems are doing. Because before, if somebody can't log onto the internet, I'm not dealing with a senior VP or something like that.
It doesn't mean a business is losing money.
No, it's not. But marketing decisions are all driven off of stats. And so you would get some pretty anxious sounding individuals calling up when they were somehow not able to pull their reports in WebTrends. And there were some pretty important sounding people who would sometimes escalate to you. I got some VPs. I got to kind of understand that. So I find that led well into what I was doing at State Farm, where yes, there were outages and we were an escalation point for outages.
Did you have to communicate to anyone about the nature of the outages, the impact of the outages, or what was being done to resolve them? Or was that kind of somebody else's role?
So to an extent, but I don't think I got good at that point just yet. I had a couple moments later on in my career where I ended up dealing with some outages where I was more responsible for the whole delivery, that I feel like I ended up having to hone those skills better. There are definitely some moments of necessity where you're like, okay, I'm good. I need to be better because I'm being counted upon for this kind of a thing.
As the systems administrator role, you're sort of like a contributor to a greater team working towards something, but at the end of the day, maybe you don't own its uptime.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We had a team of 4 other engineers with me that basically were running this. But then we had our supervisor, who was the director over that. And then we had a PM. And then we even had a Microsoft rep who was there.
Project manager?
Yeah, a project manager. That's right. And so a lot of the outages and so forth, we had to just explain to our supervisor or to the project manager. We didn't necessarily have to explain them directly to the customer. I think I was still learning from him and young. I was in some meetings where things had to be explained. And I was kind of like, wow, must be wild to be in a hot seat like that. But I wasn't yet in the hot seat. That was to come. But at that particular job, I was just focused on technology.
So let's go there for a second. Getting into that hot seat and changing from technical contributor to technical owner, or maybe more of like a tech lead role. We talked a little bit about this with Max Cannon Alexander and a couple others, this idea of the tech lead. Can you comment on what you feel that means and how that tech lead or technical ownership has played out in the roles that you've taken?
I think where it really comes down to is There's the concept of responsibility for a job, for an individual unit of work. And then there's a responsibility for your area, your field, the service itself that you support, the whole system that you support, the website you support, and so forth. There are these spheres of responsibility. As an individual contributor, a lot of the times you're given work to do, and you're responsible for getting that done. And to that extent, you're responsible. You have a shared responsibility for maybe the uptime of that service or something like that, or performance of that service or something. As a lead, now the buck is stopping with you. And so now you not only are still contributing as an individual, but you have, by extension, a responsibility for the products that the people who are by you are also producing. And what is unacceptable at that point in time is for you to point to them as an excuse for your lack of success. And maybe it is the problem, and fine, we all mess up. That's not the explanation that is acceptable to somebody else. You know what I mean? Because what was acceptable is keep the site up, keep your sphere running. And if it's not running, then it's on you to fix it. It's on you to do those postmortems or to figure out how an inefficient process needs to be more efficient, figure out how an expensive thing that you can't afford could be made affordable, whatever the job is or whatever the problem is that's in your sphere of responsibility to solve. And I feel like that was the jump that I ended up being able to make later, once I wasn't so concerned with, am I even making it at all on this technical role? Then you can start to be in a place where you can say, well, maybe I can have some responsibility that involves more than just myself.
And what makes someone want that, you think? From, okay, I want to take on more responsibility. It's a little bit more pressurized when you do. When your sphere of responsibility gets bigger, maybe it's more interesting. Maybe you have to manage people, maybe you don't, or maybe you're just responsible for the output of their work and you don't manage them like a people manager would. But you do tend to get more trips to the hot seat if things go wrong.
See, that's true. But I don't feel like I can speak for most people on this one. I guess I can speak for myself. I have observed people that get into a leadership position because they enjoy giving orders, or they enjoy a feeling of superiority or something like that. And I don't particularly enjoy that because I don't generally feel like there's a tiering that really even exists in some cases. But what does end up happening is that in any group of people, if you see people going in random directions, or you see something that it's out of control, it's not being controlled, either it's going to just explode and die, or somebody's going to pick it up and deal with it. Somebody's going to say, okay, good, I got this. I'm going to handle this. And I think that that's the same in any job, anywhere. Somebody's going to say, good, I'll run this. I'll make this come right. I'll turn this around, or I'll deal with this and I'll let you know when it's done. Somebody has to take ownership. Hey, can somebody give me a plan for how to do this? And if everybody's looking blankly at each other, either there will be no plan or somebody speaks up. Basically, every time that I've found myself in a lead role, hey, can somebody give me a plan for how we're going to do this? Nobody wants to. Fine, I'll do it. And then next thing you know, you're the lead.
Got you. You volunteered when no one else would.
Yeah.
That's a common theme, actually. My opinion is that we can take ownership of something, but we might need other people to contribute to it. Like, it might not be you applying the change that fixes the problem. It might be somebody else, but you're working with them to make sure it gets completed.
That's right.
It could be either one. But I think maybe we shouldn't assume that, I have to put my hands on the keyboard and fix this problem, only me.
And I feel like there's some places that we can get into this a bit later on in the talk too. It's that ability to know who's good at what and know how to play to their strengths, but also know where somebody does have a weakness or does not have a desire to do a particular thing. So you're going to put that on the person who can get it done. And the person who is best at really playing to everybody's strengths is, I think, what ends up defining in some cases a good or at least an effective leader. If you think that you're going to win because you're the best at everything, and then you're just going to do it, and everybody's going to watch you and cheer or something like that, then that's not leading.
Well, let's walk through your story, because you eventually became a people leader, if I read correctly. I'd love to hear the progression of how you got into that.
So the next thing that ended up happening, it wasn't in that locale at all. I ended up in Washington, D.C. via a long circuitous route, and ended up meeting my wife and ended up moving to Washington, D.C. as a result. In moving there, so I finished off my work at State Farm, and then I got a job in Virginia for UUNet, which at the time was, they said, the world's largest internet provider. So at the time, they ran all the dial-up services for America Online. In addition to that, they had a fairly large enterprise hosting service as well, multiple data centers and so forth. So this is in 99. So I got a job with their enterprise hosting group in Reston, Virginia. We had a bunch of big customers. And this is my first time really having a lot of hands-on with really big gear. A bunch of new concepts that I was learning pretty fast. These are my first purpose-built application servers were at that time. It's all Windows gear at this time. This is before I got into Linux. And my first load balanced gear was at this time. We had a bunch of relationships with big vendors. DEC, which was still around at the time, had just merged in with Compaq, and they sent us a bunch of gears, big hard drive racks that had no documentation that we had to figure out how to use and stuff. It was great. I love big gear. Big gear is so cool. Like, little kids with their Lamborghini posters on the wall and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I would have put Sun and SGI posters on my wall. Some of that gear was so cool. Yeah, I love to watch it go. At State Farm, they were servers, but they were all internal. It was all basically, extranet sort of a thing.
So internal business-facing systems.
Yes, internal business-facing. This is all external that we were doing. And so there were a couple big site launches and these are my first data center moves that we did there. We had Marriott at the time, and we did a data center move with them in the middle of the night. This is where I kind of got more holistically plugged into an overall website migration project or creation project, this was with the launch of the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 was launching. I built their server cluster, which is a bunch of NT4 servers. Got to build a big web trends cluster, actually. I'm like, hey, I know web trends. But yeah, and built that. And right before we were going to go live, we were still working out some weird bugs with load balancing and some things that the application guys were saying, hey, they weren't working quite right. And senior execs in Japan said, no, we go live now. And then it went live. I still actually have a screenshot in my photos of the error message of when it went live. And I'm like, we said not now. That was, I guess, my first real, deep dive into not just I'm on my own and I'm just tinkering with gear, but I'm part of a project, part of a whole project, which is a piece of a live website. But that being said, after PlayStation went live, that was my first time of a big website go live, and watching the live traffic come into that thing where suddenly we had 10,000 visitors crawling all over that thing. I will remember that moment forever. It was exhilarating. Midnight, I actually got in my car and went over to the data center just so I could go and watch those lights just wong, and this is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
It's pretty obvious from that discussion that Tad gets excited about making an impact, building things that a lot of people will use. I can totally see that, wanting to understand the impact you're making in your work and having that be something that fuels you. Do you have a list of the things that you like about the work you do? It could be a specific system you work on, a language you program in, the people you get to work with, the dynamic work environment, the culture of the company. It could be any number of things. But if you haven't written that list down, I think you're not as prepared as you could be for the next job. If you remember, in episodes 290 and 291, the hosts of Real Job Talk, Kat Troyer and Liz Bronson, talked about this idea of a must-have list. If you download that must-have list and go through the exercise, it's going to ask you a lot of questions about what you liked, about roles you've held in the past and the role you hold now. Those are the things that we need to list out so that we can be looking for them in new opportunities that come our way or new opportunities that we go and find. And if you have that list, you can also start to think through of how you might be able to get more of those things in the work you do now without necessarily having to change jobs. Maybe you need a new challenge, to be on a new project, to be able to learn something new. Tad talked about how important it was to make sure that he knew how to use the technology really well before wanting to take on that next level responsibility of being the technical lead and owning the output of that project or the uptime of a specific system. If you're looking for more conversations on the tech lead role, we had a great conversation with Marnie Coffey in episode 279, and she talked about how the technical lead is often involved in developing people. I guess when you podcast for a while, every episode starts to remind you of other discussions you've had on the show. So if I were to make a curated list of recommended episodes like this one, or that you might enjoy based on this episode, I would say the following. Episode 148, The Magic of Building with Chris Wall. I think both Chris and Tad are builders. They like to build stuff in the tech world. Episode 149, Find Your Gratitude, Find Your Joy with Chris Wall. He talked about the things that bring us joy and how we should have some gratitude for being able to work in technology. And if you list out those things that you love, like we talked about before, it's a great way to help yourself see how much gratitude you should have for what we get to do each day. Episode 177, Follow the Excitement, Follow the Challenge with Stephanie Wong. That was a great one where she continued to follow the things that she was interested in and allowed that to shape the career changes she made. I would also recommend listening to episode 283 with guest Jason Belk. He talked about how it's our responsibility to advocate for this industry, to help people understand what it's all about, why we find it interesting, and support future talent getting into this field. And that's exactly what Tad did when he went back to his high school. That's exactly what you can do if someone asks you what you love most about your job. But if you haven't thought about it, then maybe you can't answer that question. I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Tad. If you did, please consider rating us 5 stars and leave a review. That really helps us reach more people out in the technical community. We'll catch you next week with the next part of Tad's story.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.